The ranch had never been just land. It was history pressed into soil, memory stitched into fence posts, and generations of quiet work carried by the wind across open fields. Long before manicured lawns and matching mailboxes appeared nearby, the ranch existed on its own terms, untouched by committees, bylaws, or the kind of authority that only existed on paper. For decades, it sat beyond the reach of suburban order, protected by distance, deeds, and time. That distance began to disappear when development crept closer. What was once empty land slowly transformed into a neatly packaged neighborhood. Houses rose in perfect rows. Roads were paved where dirt paths once wandered. Signs appeared at the entrances, announcing the name of a community that marketed itself as exclusive, controlled, and proud of its homeowners association. At first, it felt irrelevant. The ranch existed long before the community, and nothing suggested the two worlds would ever collide. That assumption turned out to be a mistake. The first sign of trouble arrived quietly. Official-looking letters began appearing, filled with vague language about boundaries, community standards, and shared land use. They were easy to dismiss at first. Mistakes happened. Developers made errors. Someone probably misread a map. The ranch's records were clear, filed decades earlier, stamped, surveyed, and confirmed more times than could be counted. Still, the letters kept coming. They grew bolder. The language shifted from polite clarification to confident assertion. According to the HOA, portions of the ranch now fell under their jurisdiction. According to their documents, the land had been reclassified. According to their interpretation, long-standing ownership no longer mattered. That was when concern turned into disbelief. The idea that an HOA could suddenly claim land owned by one family for generations was absurd on its face. No sale had occurred. No agreement had been signed. No easement had been granted. And yet, the HOA behaved as though authority could be created simply by stating it loudly enough. Then came the visit. Without warning, representatives from the HOA arrived at the ranch entrance, standing at the gate as if it belonged to them. They carried clipboards, folders, and an air of practiced confidence. They inspected fences, took photographs, and walked the perimeter like surveyors who had already decided the outcome. Their presence felt invasive, not just legally, but personally. It was no longer a misunderstanding. Soon after, the letters changed again. This time, they carried threats. Citations were issued for imaginary violations. Claims were made about unauthorized use of community land. Fines were listed, escalating with each notice. The HOA's paperwork looked official enough to intimidate someone unfamiliar with the system, and that was clearly the intention. The ranch was no longer being questioned. It was being targeted. What made the situation worse was the confidence behind it. The HOA acted as if resistance was pointless. Their tone suggested inevitability, as though the outcome had already been decided behind closed doors. They referred to maps no one had seen, votes no one outside their board had attended, and authority no one had granted them. Then the situation crossed a line it could never come back from. One morning, law enforcement vehicles pulled onto the gravel road leading to the ranch. The sight alone was surreal. For a place that had existed peacefully for generations, the presence of police felt wildly out of place. The HOA had escalated the situation to its most aggressive move yet, claiming the ranch was theirs and that the current occupants were trespassing. It was a stunning betrayal of reality. The claim wasn't just wrong, it was reckless. Calling the police wasn't about resolving a dispute, it was about intimidation. It was about using authority as a weapon, hoping uniforms and badges would do what paperwork couldn't. But reality has a way of asserting itself. The officers quickly realized the situation was not as simple as the HOA had claimed. Deeds were produced. Records were reviewed. Dates were checked. The land's ownership was clear, indisputable, and older than the community trying to absorb it. What had been presented as an eviction turned into an embarrassment. The HOA had gambled and lost, at least for the moment. Instead of backing down, they doubled down. In the days that followed, the HOA's behavior became increasingly erratic. New documents appeared, some hastily assembled, others clearly altered. Survey lines were redrawn. Maps conflicted with previous versions. The story kept changing, which only confirmed what had become obvious: they were scrambling. They had made a massive assumption, that no one would push back. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. Research began. Old records were pulled. County filings were reviewed. Patterns emerged, not just about the ranch, but about the HOA itself. This wasn't an isolated incident. There were whispers from other property owners, stories of overreach, pressure tactics, and quiet intimidation. The ranch was simply the biggest target they had ever chosen. And it was about to become their biggest mistake. By the end of that first week, the conflict was no longer just about land. It was about power, arrogance, and the belief that control could be taken simply by claiming it. The HOA had underestimated the ranch, its history, and the people willing to defend it. What they didn't realize was that every threat, every false claim, and every aggressive move was being documented. Carefully. Methodically. With patience they mistook for weakness. The stage was set. The HOA believed they were enforcing rules. In reality, they were building the case that would bring their entire operation into question. And as the next community meeting approached, something shifted. What had started as an attempted land grab was about to turn into public reckoning, one the HOA was completely unprepared for. By the time the community meeting was announced, the atmosphere around the neighborhood had shifted. What was once a quiet, orderly development now buzzed with speculation. Word had spread quickly that the HOA's bold claim over the ranch hadn't gone as planned. People talked in driveways, exchanged screenshots of letters, and quietly compared notes. Something felt off, and everyone knew it. The HOA tried to frame the meeting as routine. The notice was written in the usual polished language, filled with phrases about transparency, community standards, and moving forward together. But beneath the surface, there was tension. The timing alone made it obvious that this meeting wasn't business as usual. It was damage control. Inside the meeting hall, the energy was heavy. Residents filled the seats, many more than typically showed up. Some came out of curiosity, others out of concern, and a few because they had their own unresolved issues with the HOA. The board sat at the front, composed but visibly strained. Their confidence, once effortless, now felt rehearsed. As the meeting began, the HOA leadership launched into carefully prepared explanations. They spoke about boundary confusion, clerical errors, and misunderstandings with county records. The tone suggested inconvenience rather than accountability. The ranch was mentioned vaguely, almost dismissively, as if minimizing it would make the problem disappear. But the audience wasn't buying it. What the HOA didn't realize was how much groundwork had already been laid. Long before this meeting, records had been pulled from the county archives. Old plats, original surveys, and historical deeds had been organized into a timeline that told a very different story. One that showed the ranch existed decades before the HOA was even an idea on paper. As the presentation continued, cracks began to show. Dates didn't line up. Maps contradicted earlier notices. Explanations grew more complicated instead of clearer. Each attempt to justify their actions only raised more questions. The room grew restless. Then attention shifted away from the board and toward the evidence. What had once been private documentation was now impossible to ignore. County stamps, filing numbers, and official seals spoke louder than any HOA letterhead. The contrast was stark. On one side, carefully preserved records with decades of legitimacy. On the other, newly produced documents that felt rushed and defensive. The mood in the room changed. Residents began to understand that this wasn't just about a ranch. It was about an HOA that had grown comfortable stretching its authority, assuming no one would challenge them. The ranch had simply pushed back harder than expected. As the realization spread, so did frustration. People started mentally revisiting their own experiences. The fines that never quite made sense. The warnings that escalated too quickly. The rules that seemed to change depending on who was involved. Patterns emerged, and once people saw them, they couldn't be unseen. The HOA attempted to regain control of the narrative by emphasizing enforcement consistency and legal counsel. But that only made things worse. If legal counsel had truly been involved, how had something this basic gone so wrong? If the process was solid, why did their story keep changing? Silence fell in moments where confidence used to live. The meeting stretched on, and the longer it went, the more obvious it became that the board was reacting instead of leading. Their authority depended on trust, and that trust was eroding in real time. People weren't just questioning the ranch claim anymore. They were questioning the HOA's competence altogether. Outside the meeting room, conversations intensified. Small groups formed, exchanging information and experiences. Names of past incidents were mentioned. Former board decisions were revisited. It became clear that the ranch situation had opened a door the HOA had spent years keeping shut. Meanwhile, the ranch stood as an immovable reference point. It hadn't changed. Its records hadn't changed. Its history hadn't changed. The only thing that had changed was the HOA's confidence in its ability to control the situation. What the board failed to anticipate was how quickly momentum could shift once people stopped being afraid. The HOA's power relied on quiet compliance. Once that silence broke, everything else followed. By the end of the meeting, nothing had been resolved, but everything had been exposed. No formal apology was offered. No clear retraction was made. Instead, the HOA promised further review, additional legal consultation, and future updates. The vagueness was telling. It wasn't a plan. It was a stall. And people noticed. As residents left the building, the atmosphere felt different. Lighter, but charged. There was a shared understanding now, the HOA wasn't untouchable. They could be questioned. They could be challenged. And if they could be wrong about something as big as a ranch, they could be wrong about a lot more. Behind closed doors, the HOA scrambled. Emergency meetings were held. Emails flew back and forth. Lawyers were consulted again and again. The confidence that once defined the board had been replaced with urgency and fear. The ranch wasn't just a legal problem anymore, it was a symbol of their overreach. At the same time, something unexpected began to happen. Residents started talking about change. Not just complaints, but solutions. Discussions shifted toward elections, bylaws, and accountability. Names were mentioned. Ideas were floated. For the first time in a long while, people imagined an HOA that worked for the community instead of against it. The ranch dispute had ignited something bigger. What the HOA had intended as a show of dominance had turned into a catalyst. Their attempt to claim land had drawn attention to their weakest points. And now, that attention was focused, informed, and growing. The board still believed they could recover. They thought time would dull the outrage. They assumed people would move on. They were wrong. Because as the next steps quietly began to take shape, it became clear that the story wasn't heading toward a settlement, it was heading toward a takeover. And the HOA was about to learn what happened when the people they tried to control decided to take control instead. By the time the next HOA election cycle approached, the balance of power had already shifted. The board still held their titles, but the authority behind those titles was gone. Meetings were sparsely attended by supporters and heavily watched by skeptics. Every decision was questioned. Every notice was scrutinized. The HOA, once feared for its fines and enforcement letters, now operated under a microscope it couldn't escape. The ranch dispute had become the reference point for everything. What started as an attempt to quietly claim land had turned into a public example of overreach. The HOA's refusal to fully admit fault only deepened the damage. Residents didn't need an official apology anymore. They had something more powerful: evidence. Behind the scenes, preparation was meticulous. Bylaws were studied. Election rules were reviewed line by line. Requirements for nominations, voting thresholds, and procedural timelines were understood in detail. This wasn't a protest driven by emotion. It was a calculated response built on the HOA's own framework. The irony was impossible to ignore. The same rules the HOA had used to control the community were now being used to challenge it. As election notices went out, something unprecedented happened. Multiple board seats were contested. In previous years, positions often went unchallenged, filled by default or rotated among the same small group. This time, residents stepped forward with clear platforms centered on transparency, accountability, and reform. The ranch wasn't even the headline anymore, it was the proof. As voting began, participation surged. Ballots that once went ignored were now treated like statements. People who had never cared about HOA governance suddenly understood its impact. The outcome wasn't close. One by one, the old board members were voted out. The transition wasn't dramatic in appearance, but it was seismic in effect. Authority changed hands without shouting, without spectacle, and without confrontation. It happened the way real power shifts often do, quietly, decisively, and according to the rules. With new leadership in place, the first actions were symbolic but necessary. The ranch claim was formally withdrawn. All related fines, notices, and records were nullified. Official communication was sent to the community acknowledging the error, this time without deflection or vague language. Then came the deeper review. Past enforcement actions were audited. Patterns that had once been dismissed as coincidence were now documented. Policies were rewritten. Oversight mechanisms were introduced. The HOA began transforming from a tool of intimidation into what it was originally supposed to be, a service organization. For the ranch, the outcome was simple and permanent. Ownership was reaffirmed beyond any future dispute. Records were updated and cross-filed to prevent reinterpretation. What the HOA had tried to take was now more legally protected than ever before. But the real victory went beyond property lines. The community had learned something essential: authority without accountability is fragile. The HOA had relied on assumption, silence, and fear. Once those disappeared, so did their control. The ranch had forced the confrontation, but the people had carried it through. Former board members faded quietly from the picture. Some resigned before the end of their terms. Others avoided meetings altogether. Their era ended not with scandal, but with irrelevance. Life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal, but it wasn't the same normal as before. Residents were engaged now. Meetings were attended. Decisions were questioned. Transparency wasn't optional, it was expected. And the ranch remained, unchanged and unmoved. It stood as it always had, not just as land, but as a reminder. A reminder that history matters. That paperwork can't erase truth. And that even the most aggressive attempt at control can collapse when it overreaches. What the HOA thought would be an easy win became the biggest mistake they ever made. They tried to claim something that wasn't theirs. In doing so, they lost the only thing that ever gave them power.